Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's Wednesday, April 21st, and we're breaking down both slates that we have over on DraftKings today, and the timing is a bit weird for when these slates start, so that's just something to keep in mind when building lineups today, just a little bit off sequence. But we have a 5-game early slate starting at 3:10 p.m. Eastern, which I kind of prefer over the late main slate tonight, which does start at 6:10 p.m. Eastern, and that would include 7 games. But just keep that in mind when building lineups tonight. But if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. We're getting close to 8K subs, so I do appreciate that. If you don't follow me over on social media, the handle's in the bottom right corner of your screen. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, join the community of several hundred members. Link is down below for that. You get access to the projections, the ownership projections, the optimizer, rankings, cheat sheets, data sheet, Discord chat, all of that fun stuff. Link is down below. But I think that's it for the shameless plug. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as per usual, we will start with the pitchers, then move on to the bats. And one thing I want to mention, since this is a split slate, I don't want to make 2 separate videos. I kind of just threw these guys all together. So there's a mix of early slate guys and there's a mix of late slate guys. Now, it might favor more so early slate guys, but I don't want to list the entire player pool for everybody because that's going to take forever. But hopefully you guys get the gist here. But you guys can see what time these guys start, so you'll know if they're on the early or late slate. I'm not going to specify each and every single player what slate they're on because I think you guys can read timesheets, but matchup info column right there, right under time, and that's going to be the time there. So anything from 6 o'clock after, that's going to be in the late main slate. Anything before that, it's going to be on the early slate. But we'll start up top with the ace, Max Scherzer, $10,700. He's facing the St. Louis Cardinals, which is kind of like a so-so matchup. They do have some decent bats in the lineup. Tommy Edman, Paul Goldschmidt, Yadier Molina, Nolan Arenado. It's a solid lineup up top, but it's still Max Scherzer, and he can get you 30-plus points anytime he's on the mound. So I mentioned yesterday in yesterday's video that I was going to update the spreadsheet, so the numbers are going to look a little bit different. So for the pitchers, I got 2020 and 2021 data working for us, and then for the batters, I just have straight 2021 data. So just keep that in mind when we're going over things here, but I'll try to mention that if I can when it's applicable. I don't know if I said that word right, but close enough. But anyway, Max Scherzer, he only got a 3.55 implied team total against him. Pretty heavy favor here. 8K prop over in Vegas. And looking at the past 2 seasons so far, averaged about 100 pitches per game, 3.44 ERA, 3.52 xFIP, 3.4 Sierra, 32% K rate. Not really walking too many guys. Can give up some power. That's the one bad thing with Max Scherzer is he will give up some lefty power. As you can see last season, he had a 173 ISO, and specifically to lefties, he gave up a 273 batting average with a 329 WOBA and a 170 ISO. So he's always, he's always in danger of like a solo shot or something like that. But whenever that happens, you're just going to have to hope that there's no one on base and it's just getting a solo shot instead of like a 3-run home run or a 2-run home run. But Max Scherzer is typically a guy that can mow down a lineup. So don't really have too much fears with wanting to roster Max Scherzer here. And the way the pitching slate is, on the early slate, even the late slate too, pitching is not that great today. And on the early slate, outside of Max Scherzer and Lamet, there's really no one I'm interested in. I know I have Cue Ball down here at $6,800, but how much can you really trust him? He hasn't been great this year, so I'm thinking it's probably a good slate to spend all the way up for pitching and find the value bats because I'm not seeing anything I like down low for the most part. But looking at the matchup here versus the Cardinals versus righty so far this season, striking out at a 25% clip, 8% walk rate, ISO below 200, even though 171 is actually still pretty solid. Batting average is pretty low, and some of the overall numbers aren't that great. So I can get behind some Max Scherzer today, and with the way the slate looks like, I think you're just going to have to lock him in for the most part. Then Nelson Lamet, $9,500. He's going to be activated off the IL, making his first start of the season. And it looks like he's probably going to be limited to anywhere around 70 to 80 pitches. I was looking at some of the news on Lamet, and looks like in all of his simulated games, he's thrown around 70 to 75 pitches. So, I mean, sometimes you can't get exactly to 75. So I'd imagine he's going to be in that 70 to 80 range unless he implodes or something, but I can't really see that happening because he's been such a great pitcher the past couple of seasons. But only has a 3.1 implied team total against him in Vegas. Pretty heavy favor here, 7.5K prop over in Vegas. And looking at his numbers last season, because obviously we have nothing to work with this year, but threw around 87 pitches per game, had a fastball velocity of 97 miles per hour, 2.09 ERA, which is fantastic, 3.3 xFIP, 3.16 Sierra, 35% K rate, and just some overall really, really strong numbers. So I can definitely get behind Lamet here. And a nice strikeout matchup versus the Milwaukee Brewers, and he's a strikeout pitcher, so I wouldn't be surprised if we can just rack up the strikeouts in this game. I realize he's a bit expensive, but this is definitely a pretty good spot here versus the Brewers. This season, they're striking out at a 28% clip overall, 8% walk rate, 82 WRC+, 210 batting average, and 153 ISO also helps that Christian Yelich isn't playing. He's obviously their best bat, so definitely like the upside here for Lamet. And I know it's pretty expensive. You're paying over $20,000 combined if you do roster both Lamet and Scherzer on the other slate, but it looks like right now that might be the best way to go. You should still be able to afford an expensive bat here and there, but there's plenty of value bats to make that work. So that's probably where I'm going to go early on because it's what I feel most comfortable with. I know we're probably going to be dealing with a bit of a pitch count issue here for Lamet, but you can't get too picky on these kind of slates. And even Ohtani was on a pitch count last night. Even though he walked like 100 guys, he still had a pretty decent game. So I know he's a lot more expensive, but I still think Lamet's fine here. On the early slate, he's the only early slate pitcher, or I'm sorry, the early slate. On the late slate, he's the only late slate pitcher that I do have mentioned here just because it's a terrible slate for pitching on that one. So there's obviously some other guys we're going to have to roster where you can't just roster one, but the one guy I feel pretty locked in on, at least as an SP2, maybe an SP1, depending on where I go with the SP2 or the SP1 position. But I do like David Peterson quite a bit. $7,100. He struck out 10 in his last game. Not saying he's going to do that every single time, but only a 3.22 implied team total against him here, which is pretty good. He's a slight favorite, 5.5 K prop over in Vegas. And the one thing I was looking at for the weather in Wrigley, it's looking pretty cold, and it looks like there's going to be a light wind blowing in as well, which is going to be a boost for pitching. So I can get behind Peterson here for the price point. We know he's got some upside. Looking at his numbers the past couple seasons, 59 inning sample size here, 3.9 ERA with a 4.6 xFIP, which isn't great. 4.71 Sierra, 22% carry. The numbers aren't that good, but the matchup versus the Cubs is pretty good. I also like the weather conditions as well. So far this season, the Cubs, they're striking out at a 31% clip versus lefties, 10% walk rate. Do have some power though, 257 ISO, but the overall numbers aren't amazing, but they're not terrible either. But it's mainly just banking on the weather here. And looking at the other pitchers on the slate, you really can't find anything good. So Peterson's just one of those guys that projections will like at that price point. Then another lefty here, he's on the early slate. So if you don't want to go double spend up with Scherzer and Lamet, I get it because it's a lot of salary and this is a Coors Field slate. So you want to spend up for some Astros bats, even though a lot of those guys aren't super expensive because Altuve's out. Yordan Alvarez, since he's the DH, probably won't be playing. So it's kind of just Bregman up top, and Bregman's one of my favorite plays on the entire slate. I'm going to make him the thumbnail of this video because he's facing a lefty in Coors. But if you want to get more expensive bats, Quintana here is the way to do it. He's facing Texas. So anytime a pitcher's facing Texas, I'll have some interest just because the lineup's putrid. Only a 3.69 implied team total for them. He's a pretty heavy favorite. 5K prop over in Vegas. He's not been very good so far to start the season, so we'll look past the numbers and just kind of focus on the matchup for the most part. If you want to look at the Rangers splits versus lefties so far this season, pretty good, 27% carry rate, and I mean pretty good for Quintana, not pretty good for the Rangers. Only a 6% walk rate, 125 ISO, 207 average, 272 WOBA, and a 77 WRC+. So Quintana, he is purely a matchup play, but I'm still a little bit nervous about playing him because he could easily get blown up here, but I still think he's a fine play for the price point if you don't want to go double spend up on the early slate. That's kind of it I like for pitching. Obviously, for the late slate, we're going to have to find some more guys that I like, but I'm not really super confident in anybody right now. Put them on the screen. Even Peterson was a bit of a stretch for me, but I like the Vegas numbers, like the weather, and the Cubs matchup so far has been a pretty good one for pitchers so far this season. Javier Baez seems like a free strikeout almost every single time he's up these days. I think he's sitting at around 45% for the K rate right now. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure he's like last in the league. Or I should say first in the league for strikeouts. Had that opposite there. But anyway, we'll move on to the bats at this point. We'll start with catcher, move around the diamond, and hit the outfield as well. So starting with catchers, we kind of just got a bunch of cheap guys here. And then kind of I'm trying to spend up for pitching a little bit. It just makes sense to want to go cheap at catcher. But if you have an expensive catcher you like, or you have enough money to fit one in, no problem at all. It's just catcher's not really a position I try to focus on too much. It's just whoever fits at the end for the most part. And you just have to hope they don't suck that day. But Martin Maldonado, $3,100, just a righty on lefty matchup here in Coors Field versus Austin Gomber, and they do have the highest implied team total on both slates actually today, 5.7, and obviously it's Coors Field, so yeah, best place to hit. The only issue I have with Coors Field today is it looks like the wind's gonna be blowing in. It's only gonna be 36 degrees there, so I wouldn't say it's the most optimal hitting conditions in the world. And I'm not like super enamored with Coors today. I don't think you absolutely have to play these guys, although I do like Alex Beckman quite a bit, but it's still Coors, and I've seen games pop off in the cold before, so it's not the most exciting hitting conditions in the world. But I can still get behind Maldonado just on the righty on lefty matchup here versus Gomber. Anthony Ben Boom, $2,400. The Angels were sucking for a while last night once again, but they finally put up some runs late in that game. I think they started hitting in the 6th or 7th inning. Mike Trout finally homered. It felt like he was looking like Jake Bauers out there for a couple of games when I rostered him. He finally homered for me. Then he had a double, and I think he had another single. So he finally had a good game for me. Just, man, he sucked for a couple of days. But Bemu, he makes the lineup over Kurt Suzuki here. You get a cheap lefty on righty matchup. And I know it's only a 4 plate appearance sample size this year, so we can't look anything into it. But last year he had around a 200 ISO versus right-handed pitching. It might have been a little bit more than that. I think that was with lefties and righties. I think it was closer to 250 versus right-handed pitching. So I can definitely get behind some Ben Boom here. Folty, not a pitcher that really scares me too much. If you're looking at his splits the past couple of seasons here, he's a 7.45 ERA, 5.3 xFIP, 13% walk rate. Strikeout rate's above 20%, which is the one positive for him, but he's giving up a 415 ISO and 50% fly ball rate with a 41% hard contact rate. So not really scared of Folty here, and the Rangers bullpen's pretty bad as well. So if they can get the Folty early, should be just good news here for the Los Angeles Angels. They have I say the Angels, Los Angeles Angels, and they do have a team total approaching 5. So they wouldn't be surprised if that raised up a little bit. And then Denny Jansen, $2,100 if you just want a cheap catcher here that's absolutely free. He's viable. I mean, he's not the greatest catcher in the world, but I mean, if he can get on base, you're fine at $2,100. And Garrett Richards really isn't that great of a pitcher these days, and it's a hitter-friendly park in Boston. Although I do believe the weather is out of all the games today, I think the Boston weather looks the worst, so you got to be careful there. But if this game is good to go, Denny Jansen is a free square. Not saying he's a lock for points, but he is free. And then dropping down to first base, and we'll also mention the Blue Jays do have a pretty high applied team total today, so always some RBI opportunity there. But then dropping down to first base, we have Freddie Freeman, super expensive, nearly $6,000, but he's going against Corey Kluber, and I am wearing a Corey Kluber shirt today just because he's pitching, but I just still don't think he's that great of a pitcher these days. On the Indians, he was fantastic, Cy Young contender. Now in the Yankees, he's like a 3 to 5 kind of pitcher in the rotation, just not very good. But so far this season for Freddie Freeman, 283 ISO. The batting average is low, but he's putting the ball in play. Only a 9% K rate, OPS close to 1,000, near 20% walk rate. He's elite versus right-handed pitching. Corey Kluber, just not that great of a pitcher these days, unfortunately. Kind of sucks because I used to be my favorite pitcher, but these days he's starting to fall off, injuries, those kind of things. But Freddie Freeman versus righties is always in play. Also a very hitter-friendly park in Yankee Stadium. Maybe Freddie Freeman can use that short porch to his advantage. Not a high implied team total here for the Atlanta Braves. Not really looking to stack them up too much, but still think there's some decent pieces we can use as one-offs here. Yuli Gurriel, $4,900, just a righty on lefty matchup here in Coors Field. Again, the weather looks a little bit rough, but we're still in the high altitude, which will carry the baseball. So if you can look past the cold weather, I do think the Astros are still a stackable team. It's just, I'm not like super excited about wanting to roster Coors Field guys today, but they do grade out well. And then Joey Votto, $4,500 playing in Great American Small Park, so you can definitely get behind the bats here. The problem is the Reds are a lot more expensive than they usually are. I think Tyler Naquin's above $5,000. Joey Votto is mid 4K range. Usually we can get him a little bit cheaper than that. Eugenio Suarez is expensive. Moustakas is on the IL, but Castellanos isn't playing either because he's serving that suspension. But for the most part, these guys are a little pricey. There's a couple cheaper bats that we have, but Joey Votto's fine. He's been playing well recently, and looking at his splits versus righties, I don't know if you guys can hear that. My dog's on my lap. He's kind of grunting a little bit, growling. But anyway, Joey Votto so far this season versus right-handed pitching, 14% K rate, OPS close to 800, WRC plus of 333, ISO getting close to 200 there. So I think Votto's a fine play. Just because I do think the red stack is viable today because Merrill Kelly is a guy where he's not a terrible pitcher, but he will allow a decent amount of hard contact. So in the park, like Great American Small Park, I mean, it's definitely going to favor hitting here. So we can get behind some Votto and all the Reds today. Then dropping down to second base, we have Jake Cronenworth, $3,800 going against Adrian Hauser, and he's a massive splits guy where he's pretty good versus right-handed pitching, but he's pretty horrendous versus lefties. And Jake Cronenworth's he's a pretty good hitter. Like, he's not a huge power guy, but he hits for contact pretty well. And looking at his numbers so far this season versus right-handed pitching, he's kind of showing what he did last year. The numbers aren't quite as good, but it's still a smaller sample size. But a batting average close to 300. I think that was closer to like 320, 330 last season. 12% K rate, 10% walk rate, fly ball rate up to 42%, 371 on base percentage, 351 WRC plus. Now some of these numbers are going to be a bit wacky just because it's early on in the season, so these WRC plus numbers aren't just going to be hovering around 400, 500 for all these guys when the season's all over because it's still a smaller sample size. But Cronenworth, I mean, since last year, he's been a really high contact guy versus righties. He seems to cover the plate well, so I can definitely get behind some Cronenworth versus Hauser. And if we want to look at Hauser's numbers, past couple of seasons versus lefties and righties. So versus lefties for Adrian Hauser, we're looking at a 5.03 xFIP, 4.86 ERA, 15% K rate with a double-digit walk rate, 329 batting average given up, and a whip above 2, WOBA above 400, ISO above 200. So it's a pretty good spot here for the lefties versus Adrian Hauser, because when you expand that to the righties, he's pretty tough on those guys. A 20% K rate, 3.23 xFIP, 2.41 ERA, walk rate of only 6%, and some overall pretty strong numbers, 113 ISO given up, and a 70% ground ball rate. So it's much easier to hit him, lefties to get to him. So Cronenworth does grade out well for me. David Fletcher, $3,400. I do like the Angel stack today. He's a high contact guy for the most part. He hasn't been super great so far to start the season, but leading off for a stack that I do have some interest in. And if they can get to Fulte early on, that Rangers bullpen, obviously not too much of a threat. So I get behind Fletcher at $3,400 leading off. Then Rugen Odor, $2,800. He's kind of strikeout or bust for the most part. And Ian Anderson is definitely a guy that can rack up the strikeouts. So it's a very risky matchup here for Rugen Odor. But if he can get a hold of one, there's always some home run upside for a dirt cheap price point, hitting in the more so the bottom half of this order. But it's definitely a good lineup. So you think there's some upside for him at that price point. Also in a very hitter-friendly park in Yankee Stadium. Then dropping down to third base, we have Rafael Devers, $5,600. Going against Trent Thornton, who's going to be the opener. Then looks like we're going to have Anthony K. rolling, who is a lefty, so that could be a downgrade for Rafael Devers. But, first couple innings, depending on how long Trent Thornton lasts, Devers has elite splits versus right-handed pitching. Plenty of power there, hitter-friendly park in Boston. They do have a team total above 5. Now, the one thing you got to worry about is the weather, as it does look a little bit risky as of right now. Now, it's only like 8 a.m., so I don't want to put too much stock into weather. You got to look at that closer to lock, which I will monitor. But, if the game's good to go, I like Devers as a spend-up option. But, the Red Sox are pretty expensive today outside of a couple guys, so I'm not really sure if I'm going to get there. But they do grade out well versus Thornton and Anthony K. Alex Bregman, $5,000, and it's the lefty in Coors Field and Austin Gomber. Bregman's got to be one of the best plays on the slate. Just in his career, he's crushed left-handed pitching. Doesn't really strike out too much. High-contact guy with a lot of power. Looking at his numbers this year, it's going to be a smaller sample size, but in 20 plate appearances, he's still doing very well versus lefties at 441 WRC+, 333 ISO, 333 batting average, 441 WOBA, OPS above 1,000. Is striking out quite a bit, but I'm sure those numbers will neutralize. But a 69.2% hard contact rate versus lefties this season. So I'm definitely in on Bregman. It's Coors Field. I know it's going to be freezing, and it looks like the wind's going to be blowing in a little bit, but it's still Coors. They have the highest implied team total on the slate. He's $600 less than Rafael Devers, although I guess they're not on the same slate, so that doesn't really matter. But I love Bregman here. Probably going to be an auto lock in my lineups on the early slate, and I'm going to be spending up for both pitchers, I think, more than likely. So it's going to be them two, Bregman, and then I'm going to have to find some value bets after that. But I think we can make it work. And then I'm not sure how to say his name, but I think I can say his last name, Adrianza Ihire Adrianza. Either way, he led off yesterday at $2,000. He's only $100 more today, and assuming he leads off again versus a righty, it's going to be hard to pass that value up. He's on the late slate, but like I said, Corey Kluber's not a terrible pitcher these days, but he's certainly beatable, and Adrianza has not been bad so far this year. Looking at his splits, it's a very small sample size, but a 400 ISO, 415 WOBA, 320 batting average, 720 slugging, OPS above 1,000, only a 14% K rate with a 45% fly ball rate. That's not bad at $2,100 leading off, so you can sign me up for that hitter-friendly park as well. And then dropping down to the shortstop position, we have a pair of guys in Coors Field. We have Carlos Correa, $5,400 facing the lefty in Coors. I would prefer Correa just because I like the lineup more than the Rockies, but overall as a player, I'd prefer Story over Correa. But I do like the Astros lineup a little bit more, which does make me lean his way, but he's also a little bit more expensive as well. So that's a bit of a conundrum, but Correa, he's fine versus lefties, fine versus righties as well. If they can get the Gomber early on, the bullpen for the Rockies isn't very good. They have the highest implied team total on the slate. I like Correa if you are stacking up the Astros. Don't think you have to plan today, though. Trevor Story, a little bit easier to fit in your lineup, so I could see him being a little bit more popular. It's going up against a decent pitcher in Urquidy. I think that's how you say his name. It's either Urquidy or Urquidy. I tried to remember over the past season or so, but it does escape my mind a little bit. But Trevor Story, one of the best, just one of the better overall players in baseball. I wouldn't say he's the best. He's not the best player in baseball. Obviously, that's reserved for guys like Mike Trout, Mookie Betts. But he's definitely in the upper echelon tier, and he's playing in a very hitter-friendly park in Coors Field. Again, tougher matchup here versus Urquidy, but I can get behind some Story if you have $5,000 of shortstop left, or if you just want to build around him. That's Coors Field, so I get it. But I would prefer going with Bregman at the similar price point, and maybe just trying to find a value shortstop, or just if you had the money for Correa, I wouldn't mind that either, just to get more Astros in my lineup, just to make sense correlation-wise. Then Nico Goodrum, also eligible at second base, going up against it's a lefty Tyler Anderson here. So last season, Nico Goodrum was fantastic versus left-handed pitching. So far this year, it's a smaller sample size, but he's still doing very well. Only 13 plate appearances, but a 364 batting average, 502 WOBA, 364 ISO, and a 502 WRC+. Again, we are working with very small sample sizes here, but going back to last season, he had some really good splits versus lefties. Not great versus righties, but versus lefties, pretty darn good. And Tyler Anderson's not that great of a pitcher. Then dropping down to the outfield here, we have the big fish, Mike Trout, $6,000, super expensive, but he crushes righties over the course of his career, and versus righties, he's still doing it once again this season, even though it's still a small sample size, but he's showing life early on. 35 batting average, 556 WOBA, 47 ISO, 556 WRC+, 872 slugging. You guys get the idea. It's Mike Trout. He's very good at baseball, and he went deep versus a righty last night in Jordan Lyles, and I wouldn't be surprised. Or was it versus Jordan Lyles? I forget if he was still in. Either way, it was versus a lefty, so I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again to Faulty, who will give up some power. Shohei Ohtani, $5,100. He pitched last night, so he didn't hit, but man, a couple nights ago when I think all of us played Shohei Ohtani, I want to say he was around 70-80% owned in cash games. Mike Trout was up there as well. He went deep off of his former teammate, but the guy made an excellent play. Was it Garcia that made that play? But he had it over the fence. The guy made a fantastic play, but I do like Ohtani here quite a bit. He's very good versus right-handed pitching. So far this year versus righties, he's batting 342, 447 WOBA, 316 ISO, some pretty solid numbers all around, a 44% hard contact rate, so I can definitely get behind some Showtime Ohtani here. Michael Brantley, $5,000. I prefer him versus righties, but if you are full stacking the Astros, I wouldn't leave Michael Brantley off your last, but I don't think you're going to get there in cash games just because it's a lefty-on-lefty matchup. But Brantley's been hitting very well so far this season. Again, small sample size, only 52 plate appearances, but batting over 320 and not really striking out too much, and just some overall really strong numbers. And he was one of the only Astros bats that actually did something last night, so he's got that working for him. But $5,000 is a bit rich for me, but he'll see a righty at some point, and they can get the Gomber early on. He'll see plenty of righties in that bullpen. Jared Walsh, $4,800, kind of similar plays to Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani, but definitely a step below those guys, but that reflects on the price point as well. But he's hitting very well this season, and if you look at his numbers versus right-handed pitching, again, smaller sample size, but 364 ISO, 42 WRC+, strikeout rate of only 10%, 12% walk rate, so he's got very good ratios there. 333 batting average, and just some overall pretty strong numbers. I'm not that scared of Faulty, so I can definitely get behind another Angel stack tonight. Or I guess I should say this evening, since they play at 4. Charlie Blackmon, $4,600. Mainly a price play here, and I don't usually say that for Charlie Blackmon because he's typically above $5,000, but he's pretty cheap, and you get that lefty-on-righty matchup in Coors Field. I know he hasn't been great so far this year. He's only got a 60 WRC+ and a 184 batting average, but we know Charlie Blackmon over the course of his career has always been a fantastic hitter, so that's going to turn around at some point. And Coors Field, I know it's not a great matchup versus Urquidy, but I still think he's a decent play here. Jesse Winker, $4,500. I do like that red stack quite a bit in the late slate, and he's going to be leading off more than likely mid 4K price point, which isn't super expensive, and the guy's just a really good hitter, especially versus righties. So far this season versus them, he's batting 400, 452 WOBA, 200 ISO, 452 WRC+, and a near 450 on base percentage. So Jesse Winker, definitely a pretty solid play in my book. It's only 29% ground ball rate as well, so he's able to lift the ball. And we're in a very hitter-friendly park in Grand Market Small Park as well. Merrill Kelly's the guy that will give up plenty of hard contact. Austin Meadows, $3,100, or I wish he was $3,100, $4,100. He had a great game last time out. Going up against Jacob Junis here, pretty average pitcher for the most part. Can give some power to both lefties and righties, but Meadows, he's fine versus righties. Got some decent pop versus them, so I like the price point here for the most part. Also an upgrade going to Kansas City over the Trop, even though it's not the greatest hitter park in the world, but still an upgrade outside of the Trop. Cole Calhoun, $3,000. Molly, never really sure how to say his name, but he might be a viable pitcher on the late slate just because there's not that many pitchers I like. But if you're not playing him, Cole Calhoun, $3,000 is a really interesting option here because I feel like he's just way too cheap. He's great versus right-handed pitching. It's a very hitter-friendly park, especially for lefty power. So I can definitely get behind some Cole Calhoun here because he's just a massive value play in my opinion. So far versus righties this season, it's kind of just been so-so, but he had a decent night last night. I feel like every time I watch Luis Castillo, it was either Pavin Smith or Cole Calhoun. They had a hit almost every single time they were up, but definitely at the price point here. And Tyler Maley's the guy that will struggle with lefties compared to the righties. So I do prefer the lefties here on Arizona. Not really looking to stack these guys, but a couple of these guys are fine as one-offs. The Miles Straw, $2,700. I could see him being pretty chalky. Hey, buddy. I could see him being pretty chalky on that early slate just because of the price point. He should be leading off versus a lefty in Coors Field. And so far this season, while he hasn't been great, I think it's serviceable at 2,700 bucks. A little bit close to 300, 263 batting average. He has virtually no power, but he doesn't strike out. 4% strikeout rate, 13% walk rate, so he's got good ratios there. But it's really just a price play here in Coors Field. But with that being said, guys, I think that's going to be it for the video. So I hope it was helpful. And if it was, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button, turn the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new videos. If you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. The optimizer, ownership projections, Discord community, all that fun stuff linked is down there. But I think I'm going to stop rambling, guys. Hope the weather is wonderful where you are, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll see you guys in the next video.